Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, I'm interviewing Miles Taylor today. And Miles is the cautionary tale for what could happen if the Trump administration goes from bad to worse to the worst it could be. Miles did the thing he thought was right and is now being punished for it through legal means, through political means from the very top. Donald Trump always liked to say, if it could happen to him, it could happen to anybody. Well, everybody, it's happening to Miles and it could happen to you too. Please listen to this conversation and understand the threat to individual liberty and freedom and justice that we're all facing. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Miles Taylor, a national security expert, New York Times bestselling author, and former chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. In 2018, while at DHS, Miles authored the anonymous New York Times essay from inside the Trump administration, warning of presidential misconduct, and subsequently revealed himself to be the author. He has written 2 national bestsellers about threats to democracy, A Warning and Blowback, both available wherever fine books are sold. He's a former CNN contributor, the host of the podcast The Whistleblowers, and author of the Substack newsletter Treason. Today, he's coming to us from Washington, D.C. Miles, welcome.
Reed, great to be with you. I wish it was under more fun circumstances, but a lot of serious stuff going on in the country right now.
No, there is. And, I think I interviewed you about a year ago when your second book came out, which was a warning to what would happen if subsequently what happened. So for the folks who know a little bit about you but don't remember the entire story, just give us a few minutes of how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, well, look, I spent most of my career in the national security community and public service, went into government like a lot of people after 9/11 as a lifelong conservative, and worked in the Bush White House and then on Capitol Hill. And then when Donald Trump got elected, I think a lot of us, you and I included, Reed, it was very obvious who this man was. And I had no interest in going into his administration. And a mentor of mine, someone I looked up to, John Kelly, took the call. And he, too, I think, was really worried about what might happen if an untested person like Donald Trump took the presidency. And he decided to go in as Secretary of Homeland Security. And after a few months of the administration, I agreed to go in with him and help him steady the ship. And eventually became chief of staff over there at the Department of Homeland Security. And, Reed, again, it's no surprise what I saw on the inside of the Trump administration. I found to be pretty deeply morally repulsive. And this idea that we could steady the ship turned out to be totally wrong, because ultimately Donald Trump very much resisted the better advice of his advisors not to do illegal things, and systematically started to fire or push out the people who were warning him against inappropriate conduct. So during that time period, I wrote an anonymous opinion piece in the New York Times to basically say to the American people, you don't understand. It's not as bad as it looks in the Trump administration. It is so much worse. And his own lieutenants think he's unfit for office. And to me, that felt like the type of thing that we as a group of unelected bureaucrats should not sit around talking amongst ourselves. That was the type of stuff they needed to tell the American people, because we weren't the ones to make the decision about whether the president got rehired or fired in 2020. That was up to the voters. And so I put that message out there publicly, and then Reed, before the 2020 election, unmasked myself, because I didn't want to send the message that anonymity was the answer in the political environment we were in. To me, it was evident that people needed to take off their figurative masks and tell the truth about this man, myself included. So that's what I did.
So I've had a lot of friends like you who went into the that first Trump administration with the idea of, I can help steady the ship. It will be worse without me. Some, not surprisingly, remained there and are working for him again. But there are a lot like you, certainly different from your particular experience, where they said, nope, I'm not going to do this again, or I'm leaving. But give us a sense of when it was the tipping point. What was the thought that went through your head, or was there a particular act after, whether or not it was being at DHS, having been maybe to a meeting at the White House, where you said, I can't do this anymore, and you decided to take pen to paper, first anonymously and then subsequently making yourself public?
Well, I wrote the piece after a very personal incident. I mean, there had been a lot of reasons, and probably a lot better reasons, to have snapped during the Trump administration and said, I can't put up with this anymore. This is wrong. Um, the family separation debacle had just happened. It was something that a number of us had tried very hard behind the scenes to stop from going forward. The president overruled all of those efforts and went to the attorney general and pushed it into existence. That would have been a good reason for anyone to leave the Trump administration. But it was actually something that happened just after that, which was a mentor from Capitol Hill. Actually, the first person I met when I moved to Washington, D.C., the first member of Congress I met, John McCain, passed away. And he was a hero to me. And his willingness to stand up to the president, who was one of the only people within the Republican Party at the time that was standing up to Donald Trump, was pretty inspiring to me. And from inside the administration, there were a number of us cheering on McCain over on Capitol Hill to keep holding Trump's feet to the fire. He, of course, passes away. And I'm over in Australia on the other side of the world for an intelligence meeting. And I get a call in the middle of the night from the White House. And they want to have us, the Department of Homeland Security, order all federal buildings in the nation to raise their flags from half-staff all the way back up. Why? Because the president wanted to proactively dishonor John McCain. He was mad that he was seeing flags at half-staff to honor this man who he hated, and he wanted to raise the flags back up. And in that moment, we, of course, said no. And, John Kelly, who was then White House Chief of Staff, convinced the president not to do it. But at that point, I thought, this is just disgusting. There's a bad man stomping on the grave of a good one. And I went and I sat down at my computer in the hotel room and I just started writing what started off as a journal entry, basically, just saying, here's what's happening inside this administration. This is not okay. And, in the course of sitting there writing that, it was like 3 a.m, Reed, over there in Australia. I thought it's pretty stupid that I'm writing this to myself because these are the things that people should know about. And I reached out to a contact over at the Times and I said, I might have a piece I want you guys to run. But I will say this. I mean, look, I knew publishing that anonymously would get attention. That was the point. The point was the device itself would get people to focus on the message rather than obsessing with the messenger. Because if I came out in my own name, Donald Trump would have made it a half-day news story and moved on. But the fact that he didn't know who I was would mean people would come pay attention to that story and understand how serious this situation really was. And so, as we got closer to 2020, though, I signaled publicly that I would come forward in my own name because I felt like it was important to take ownership of those words and for other people to do the same. But that obviously came with a lot of consequences.
So what was the amount of time between when you wrote the op-ed and when you left the administration, and what was it like to feel then actually behind enemy lines?
Look, I quit a few months after the opinion piece, and there was one particular episode that was pretty galling as we were down at the southwest border, and the president wanted to order our frontline agents to seal the border and turn away any asylum seekers in a way that would have violated federal law. And we made that very clear to the president, that if you do the thing that you are telling us to do, it will break the law. And he said, I don't care. If you go to jail, I will pardon you. And those were almost his exact words. And at the time, I could not think of a clearer and more naked act of corruption than the president telling us, go break the law and I'll give you a get out of jail free card. And I wrote up exactly as the episode had transpired and I sent it to the lawyers. And I said, I want you to know that this has just happened. I don't think it's okay. And that's when I started planning my departure. But on the other side of things, you also know that you're walking into a total buzzsaw. Donald Trump has a very long history of revenge against his adversaries, whether in business or in politics. And even though I had signaled Reed, hey, I'm going to come out under my own name, I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't terrified of what this would mean for my life on the other end. It would have been much better for me to have left government, gone into the tech sector, and just made money and just kept my head down forever. And some of the people that I worked with in the administration, some people that you and I both knew, that's what they did. They shared the same opinions you and I had, and they knew how bad this was, but they didn't want to take on the implications for their personal life. And so they just kind of faded off into the background and said nothing. I did not think I could live with myself if I did that, much as I'm sure you felt when you came forward, is I felt like I got to look at this guy in the mirror the rest of my life. And if he acts like a cowardly shit, then I'm not going to like being inside this skin. And that's ultimately why I made that decision.
I think this is an important thing, Miles, because there are a lot of people who want to consider themselves part of the resistance. This idea that, oh, I'm posting this, I'm saying that, breaking news here and breaking news there. But the truth is that most of that is noise and it's gone. What you did, and in not only doing it anonymously and then in your own name, was actually speak truth to power, first anonymously, so you've got them all running around, and then secondly, in your own name, where, there were people who were like, I was in that meeting with him, or does he know that? And those people also, as you mentioned, the mirror, have to look in themselves in the mirror and say, well, he did it and I didn't. And then the rationalizations will continue. So tell us what it has been like since the first Trump administration ended, that interregnum of 4 years of Joe Biden, and now that Trump has come after you and Chris Krebs, another member of Homeland Security, who had the audacity to say that no, actually, the 2020 election was free and fair and Trump lost it. So give us a sense of what this last couple of years has been like.
Well, hey, look, I'll always give you the no BS answer. The last few years have been wonderful, and I'll tell you why. Is because my whole life was blown up in the wake of unmasking myself, and that episode had cost me my home, my job, my marriage at the time, my personal security, my savings, everything that you could imagine going wrong went wrong in the wake of that. And I put all those pieces back together in the past 4 years. I met the love of my life. I got married. We had a baby. I went back to the private sector. And then after publishing the last book, warning about that this would be a revenge machine if Trump won, I decided, I'm done with public life. I just want to be done completely. And hopefully we don't reelect this guy. That's not what the country did. They reelected him. And from the day after the election, my wife and I knew, or at least we suspected, that there was a very high likelihood that he would, in some way, try to come after us. And the other people on the so called enemies list would be targeted. And as the months went on, sort of that dread started to pile up. And then one day on April 9th, a few weeks ago, I got a text message from someone who said, hey, I think you need to turn on the news. The president's signing an executive order related to you. And I suspected, Reed, that this was going to be like some of the other orders we've seen where the president has stripped people of their security clearances, groups of people at a time. And we were prepared for that possibility. What we were not prepared for was that he would go a big step further than that. And for the first time, I'm told in American history, a president ordered an investigation into a former critic by name in an executive order, to me and to Chris Krebs. And as I listened to the press conference in the Oval Office, I realized in that moment, this is going to be much more serious than what I had expected and much bigger than just me, because Donald Trump set a precedent in that moment that an American president can just sign revenge investigations into existence with the stroke of a pen. And so that's what we are now fighting back against.
Can you explain to us how in Washington world security clearances work? Because I had several security clearances back in the day when I was in the administration, but I didn't think of keeping it when I left. So give us a sense of why you're able to hold on to that, and what does it allow you to do professionally that removing it, and this is a logistical question, Miles, I'm sorry to break in, but tell us what that means.
When people go work in the national security community, whether they work at the CIA or the Department of Homeland Security or the White House, a lot of times they need access to sensitive information collected through sensitive means, whether that's spies or wiretaps, in order to do their jobs to protect the United States. And so you go through a long background check, and ultimately the government says, here, we trust you. We trust you with this information, and go do your job. There are a lot of people in the private sector who keep their security clearances because they do work like engaging with companies that need to work with the national security community, engaging with other patriotic organizations that help protect American troops or the border or other aspects of American life. And so one of the things that this administration have realized that they can do to go after the president's enemies, sort of their easy button, if you will, is identify any of them who hold or have held security clearances who may still do work where their job, where their livelihood depends on their ability to transact in that national security bubble and then to pull it away because the authority for a security clearance ultimately goes up towards the president of the United States. So that's one of the things they've been doing with these orders, and including the case of myself and Chris Krebs, is declaring us to be national security threats and taking away those orders. But it goes further than that, Reed, because it would be one thing if the president just revoked my clearance or Chris Krebs' clearance. But these orders then said associates of those individuals. So they know that most of the friends I have in this town are people who work in the national security community. And it's a way to immediately create social isolation around that person. There's no evidence that I committed a crime. There's certainly no evidence that any of my friends have committed a crime. But by creating that guilt by association and saying, if you are close to Miles Taylor, we're going to take your security clearance away, you are threatening those people's jobs and their livelihoods and their families and their future. And so, yeah, they scatter and they go run. And that's something that we've seen in the immediate wake of this. A lot of friends are terrified to even be associated with us. And then, of course, the order goes further and directs federal investigations into the two of us, which is an extraordinary step. And it's one of the reasons why we're taking legal action against the administration is because it is so blatantly unconstitutional, not just a wrong order or a mean order or an order that's had terrible consequences for our family, an order that fundamentally violates constitutional rights. You do not need a permission slip in the United States of America to criticize the president. And that criticism is not classified. When I criticized Donald Trump, it wasn't classified. But him now saying that it's classified to criticize him is him effectively criminalizing free speech in this country.
What does it mean to be a threat to the federal government? Legally, politically, what you're describing there seems a lot like, the punishment is the process with the revocation of a security clearance. Has the FBI or the Justice Department approached you or your counsel to say you are an active target of an investigation?
Both Chris Krebs and I have indicators that we are both under federal investigation above and beyond anything related to our security clearances as the president directed. And so the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security both confirmed that Chris was under federal investigation. And in my case, we've received notification that, friends going as far back as high school have been contacted by investigators. And this is the really insidious thing about it, Reed, is we don't know what they're looking into. So the president, like you said, has already made a determination that someone is guilty of the crime. And now he's drafted an order and said, but go find me the evidence. This is the inverse of how the justice system is supposed to work. There's supposed to be predicate evidence of a crime. Investigators investigate it. They propose charges. It goes through the system. Instead, the president of the United States has already determined Chris and I to have been guilty of something. And now he's directing his agency, oh, by the way, go find the thing that makes them guilty. People don't have to agree with me or Chris and our criticism of Donald Trump. That's perfectly fine. But it should terrify any Republican or any Democrat that it's possible for a president to do this. If Republicans lose the White House, and let's say Bernie Sanders goes into the White House, does General Michael Flynn, do any of those people want Bernie Sanders to be able just to take a piece of paper and say, investigate this person, I think they're guilty of treason? That's really, really scary stuff. That's stuff that definitionally someone who's a conservative should be opposed to. But it's quite actually what the president is doing with these orders. And our fear is it spreads further than that. Already, Reed, the attorney general has used the orders against me and Chris as justification to roll back protections for journalists in the United States. There is longstanding Justice Department policy that DOJ faces a much higher standard if they want to go conduct searches, warrantless searches of a journalist's house or their devices. But they've rolled back those policies. And in that memo, they said the reason was because of these orders against me and Chris. They are using this as a justification to crack down on the free press. And that's why Americans should be concerned, is that will create a chilling effect across this country if he keeps using this weapon like he's done with law firms and universities and other targets of presidential revenge.
As far as the media is concerned, and some law firms and some colleges, we've already seen the premature capitulation in which they're just trying to keep their heads down. And there's that quote, right? You may ignore politics, but politics doesn't ignore you. Do you believe that you and Chris are the tip of the iceberg? If so, what do you think the threshold would be to get someone investigated, deemed a threat like you? Because let's be clear, since Donald Trump stepped off the escalator, and I'm part of this, and there's a lot of our friends that are part of this, attacking Donald Trump politically is not just a cottage industry. For some people, it's what they do all day, every day. So do you think there's a process, or is this just your name came up, Krebs's name came up? Is it Kash Patel and Bongino sitting there with their legal pads like Michael Corleone and Sonny Corleone and The Godfather saying they're next, they're next? What do you think the process unrolls? How do you think that looks?
I think it's arbitrary, and I think that's so much worse than if there actually was a process. And you're seeing that with, the recent news of Columbia being the next university that's being targeted by the administration. I think there's a deep arbitrariness to how the president and his lieutenants want to go after targets of revenge. And that makes it so that anyone might be in those crosshairs. I certainly didn't think Chris and I would be the first targets of those types of orders. Perhaps it would be someone like Hillary Clinton or James Comey he's gone after. But Hillary Clinton and James Comey may well be next. I mean, they just announced that they're going to launch an investigation into former President Biden and his senior aides. And there was no telling when that would come or if that would come. So the arbitrary nature here, I think, was especially disturbing. But there's also, Reed, to be very blunt with you, there's the really pernicious fact of just these orders themselves. I mean, your average American looks at this stuff happening and it's like, news story in Washington, that Miles Taylor guy, he'll probably be fine. It's just a piece of paper and a name on a piece of paper and he's being mean. This is a modern blacklist. And that blacklist has consequences. I immediately had to leave my job after April 9th. I am the sole income earner in my household. I have a wife and a baby at home that I have to take care of. And we had to make an immediate decision as a family, which is to survive in the wake of this. If I am unemployed, my wife has to go back to work. We've been a stay-at-home mom since our baby's been born. So my wife's had to go back to work. I've had to take care of our child. And then you face the prospect of extraordinary legal bills to deal with this situation. I mean, lawyers don't just fall out of the sky and say, I'm here to help you. I'm your fairy godmother lawyer. Let me defend you against the president.
Unless you cut a deal with Donald Trump, in which case you get thousands of hours of pro bono work.
Which is what they want. And that's where I think these orders against individuals are going. They want people like me or people like you, if threatened with an investigative executive order, to cut a deal with the White House and say, no, don't do it. I'll apologize to Donald Trump. No, don't do it. I'll step down from my job as long as you don't put my name on that list, because they don't want to face those consequences. And it's a very scary thing. I mean, the first conversation Hannah and I had after this happened was, she looked at me and said, do you think we're going to need to sell the house? And I hate to say it, but my answer to her was, I don't know, because I don't know if we're going to be able to find legal counsel. Now, we're very lucky. We had an organization step forward to help do this. A nonprofit organization called Whistleblower Aid said, we've got your back. And they launched a legal defense fund called endpresidentialrevenge.org, END, endpresidentialrevenge.org. And effectively, Reed, I've crowdsourced my legal defense, which is something that, if this happened to me 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. And that is one silver lining in all of this, is I've got people in, Ohio and California and other places who've reached out and said, we're not going to let this happen to you, and we will help you cover legal costs. But I don't know how other people would do it if they were caught in these circumstances and didn't have the network or the means to make something like that happen.
We should be clear, Miles, that the coverage of legal fees is good, but to your point about a livelihood and a mortgage and the incredible pressure, both emotionally, from a personal security perspective, right? Like, that doesn't absolve you of those issues or of those kinds of pressure, right? Like that remains. And I think that's the other part of this too, is, as I said, the process is the punishment. The very nature of being named, right, is enough to get friends to scatter, to get colleagues to say, call me when this blows over, because it's just not worth the trouble for them. And they have a life. It's not that they don't love you. It's that they have to make a value judgment. I think that there's a lot of people, I'll say this, who have gotten mixed up with the Trump administration, for whom, Miles, frankly, that 30 pieces of silver came way too easy for them. And I'll just say this, as I'm sitting here talking to you, like, I'm out of grace for them. I hate to say that, because I try not to get too wound up in these things personally and emotionally. But when you see what you and Krebs are going through, and inevitably what others will go through, because remember, we're 4 months into this? Right? 5 months into this? This is just getting going. And so I think that's the other part too, is that there will be people all over the greater metro Washington area and elsewhere who are now, they're like, am I next? Am I next? And that in and of itself, right? Look, we had the conversation. Should we leave the country? Do you think they'll come after you? I'm like, I don't think so. But to your point about the arbitrary nature, you don't know.
You don't know. And you don't know if they're going to abuse investigative steps. I mean, we've had to have very real conversations with lawyers of, do they think they're going to raid our home? What indications will we have of that? What happens when something like that goes down? But also, will they try to do that with friends or family members? And, I know you've experienced some of this too on the social isolation piece with at least what was your old group of friends is now how I think of it. I thought after coming forward in 2020, I had that culling of my friend group, right? The people who were too scared to associate, self-selected out. And I thought that had happened. But the environment is so much different now. And I won't name the individual, of course, but a very, very close friend of mine, very close friend of mine in the wake of this, the type of person you expect to be with you in the trenches. So, we've gone through deaths and divorces and all those things together, comes to me and says, hey, listen, you haven't heard from me in a while because I need to keep my distance until this is all over, because effectively the person doesn't want it to affect their business interests with the federal government. Man, that's a gut punch when the people you most expect to be there in the trenches with you say, hey, buddy, sorry, I can't be a part of this. Other people, another guy who was at my wedding, who was a senior trade official in the executive branch, got fired by the White House because the White House found a photo of him on Facebook at our wedding and then humiliates him by putting it in the Washington Post. And that's the kind of vindictiveness. Is that individual a national security threat because they were at my wedding? Do you think my wedding was like, they were serving classified documents as hors d'oeuvres? What's the rationale there? The rationale is nothing but revenge. And that man's life is destroyed. And then, another close friend sees what's happening to those people and says, I'm sorry, buddy, I can't be there for you. This is just too ugly. That is genuinely how authoritarianism starts to work, is you create this cascading social isolation. I'll give you one more example of it. I'm speaking at an event in a couple weeks to raise for this fundraiser for End Presidential Revenge. And there was a company that was going to cater the event. And we just got a phone call and they said, hey, the caterers had to drop out. I said, why? They're going to be paid to serve food and drink. And they said, yeah, they're worried about the event. I said, oh, politically, do they disagree with my criticisms of Donald Trump? Fine, I understand. And I said, no, they actually totally agree. They're afraid that the immigration status of their employees will be challenged if they cater to this event. They're worried about their employees being deported in revenge to doing an event with me. That is a level of social fear I did not think. Well, certainly it was not the case in Trump 1.0, and now is something that we've never seen before in the modern era in this country.
So, Miles, to that end about finding your friend on Facebook, I'm reminded of the story of Hassan Piker. He's a very popular progressive streamer, and he was picked up at O'Hare Airport coming back into the country a few weeks ago. And he wrote a story about it, that he was picked up, questioned by ICE agents about his belief that the United States was in the wrong place. Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. And they were asking him specific questions. But if you start to pull the thread on that, that means that they are looking for specific people. They are looking for people. They are looking at flight manifests. They are looking at people coming across borders, and they are picking them out of line in those big rooms that you go back through passport control. And so if you were going to do that, how would you do it?
You would take the entirety of the counterterrorism apparatus we built after 9/11 that is so finely tuned to be able to find a needle in a haystack. In this case, to find foreign operatives, to find terrorists that are a threat to the United States. And you would just turn it towards domestic political enemies. And you would bubble wrap it in legalese so it looked like those individuals maybe had committed crimes or were under reasonable suspicion. And then you would go turn the device on. And I think we are seeing examples of that, Reed. And that is one of my big fears. Guys like you and I after 9/11, I think rightfully said, we've got to go build those apparatuses. We've got to go find these guys. We've got to go get bin Laden, his associates, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, you name it. We needed to go build some of the elements we see across the Department of Homeland Security. But I will say, the civil libertarians, they were right. They were right that if we built these tools without thinking very deeply about the safeguards, one day they could be misused by a bad intentioned chief executive to do some very dangerous things. The naive thing that people like me thought was, but there will never be anyone like that in the Oval Office. We won't ever have a president that says, hey, go use the terrorist watch list to put my enemies on it and search them at the border and follow them and listen to their devices and go and arrest them and harass them. Ooh, it never occurred to me that that would happen. It has happened. And I don't think we've seen the full extent of it. And to your question of if it were me with nefarious intent, what could I do with those tools? Absolutely extraordinary wreckage. And again, a listener might say, come on, like that would just be so ham-fisted for them to put the president's enemies list in the terror watch list and go after them. I'm telling you, it's a very easy thing to do. And this is how they would do it. The example you gave of the individual with Gaza, I would guess, I don't know this to be the case, but I would guess that that person, maybe because they advocate on these causes, has been at an event where there's maybe an individual who's talked on the phone before to someone who has a tie to a militant group in Gaza, right? There's some sort of chain hop connection to a dangerous individual.
Right. And it could be 8, 9, 11 steps. It doesn't matter.
It could, but it could be just enough for them to say, well, based on our policies, yeah, we can wink, nod, say that that person is a known or suspected terrorist, add them to the list. And then no one questions it inside the government after the fact. It's just collect on that person, interview that person, harass that person's lawyer. And pretty soon you can daisy chain into, oh, it's just people that support causes the president doesn't like that they're going after. And it will take a very long time to look under that rock and for people to realize, oh, no. It started with political targeting and not some legitimate national security purpose. The Department of Homeland Security is sprawling. The oversight is very weak. And I think it's one of the bigger worries about a second Trump administration. And these words police state that always seem so hyperbolic are potentially not so hyperbolic if they start to do that.
So, in the wake of the Boulder, Colorado Molotov cocktail attacks, the Trump administration said there are 12 countries that can no longer send citizens here, and I think 7 more that there's some level of scrutiny. Of course, the gentleman was Egyptian, and they didn't put Egypt on the list. But they utilized that attack, and it was an awful attack, as the basis, as the predicate for that action. Do you believe we'll see more of those types of mini Reichstag fires, that they will find an event that has no connection to anything else, but they will utilize it for a specific purpose they've been looking for?
I'm so worried about it, Reed. They are dying for it. Tom Homan, the president's border czar, who I worked with very closely when I was at DHS, said something the other day that actually put the hair up on my neck. I got the chills when I read it. And he said, look, these millions of people who've come across the border illegally, he's like, something much bigger and worse than 9/11 is coming. And I hope he's wrong. I very much hope he's wrong. And I certainly would worry about an attack of that magnitude. My even bigger worry is that this administration would use it to do things we've never imagined would happen on American streets, and specifically to militarize law enforcement in this country. Make no mistake, Donald Trump wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy U.S. troops on American territory to enforce U.S. law. That is illegal under the law, but he wanted to use the extraordinary presidential powers to break glass, break the Constitution, and do it. We had to convince him out of it. I remember on the eve of a State of the Union address, rushing to the White House to persuade the president not to write into the address that he had invoked the Insurrection Act to deploy the U.S. military. This was something we were dealing with in the first term. I'm worried that this will happen in a second term. I've been saying it for years, but it's where he wants to go. Because when he first became president, he asked the lawyers, what is the apex of my authority? Where am I most powerful? And they told him, look, if you invoke the Insurrection Act, you could deploy U.S. troops to go do things, you could never imagine. That has stuck in his head. And he called it his magical powers at the time. Multiple times I heard him use those words like, maybe we use the magical powers. Which is crazy, on its face, right? That's such a cartoonish thing, but that's who he is. But the effects aren't cartoonish. The effects are very, very scary if that happens. And this is where that could go if the courts and the Congress are not able to be a check on this president.
Which they so far haven't been. And I think it's always a good reminder that we've already seen a lot of this 5 years ago in the wake of George Floyd, that millions of people took to the streets. Local and state police officers and some National Guard really took it to protesters. And he sent officers from DHS into Portland, Oregon, right, on his own authority. So we've already seen this. We've seen the pictures of the guys standing, in formation on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So this is not new news, but unfortunately, Miles, we have an incredibly short memory. Last question, philosophically. There was a part of your Substack post that I thought was really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is because it was the second time this week I saw it, but I want to get your sense of it. You said this is anti-constitutional. And my friend Alexis Coe, who's a presidential historian, she used that expression too. She had just testified before Congress. We should stop saying unconstitutional and we should say anti-constitutional. Unconstitutional means a violation of this particular document and set of rules. It said anti-constitutional means you don't believe it matters anyway. You don't believe in any of it.
And further than that, you are at war with the document. You are intentionally trying to undermine its underpinnings. And in this case, with the EOs against me and Krebs, there's two big ways that this is anti-constitutional. And one is the president is quite clearly blowing past all the checks and balances in the justice system, where there's a whole process for people to question whether they should remain free, to question whether they should be charged, prosecuted, go to prison. There's a rightful process. The founders spent a hell of a lot of time thinking about that. These types of arbitrary orders fly in the face of that. And that's why we are challenging them legally. But the second thing is even more fundamental. And we celebrate our 250th anniversary as a country next year, our 250th birthday. And for 249 of those years, we were a nation of the rule of law and a paragon of free speech. This is an order that intentionally aims to suppress speech. It aims to intimidate people who are associated with someone who engaged in free expression. And I am telling you firsthand, it's worked. It works when they do it. It scares people and it shuts them up. That is not unconstitutional. That is anti-constitutional. It flies in the face of the pillars that our founders put in place to uphold this democracy. And the effects could be extraordinary and irreversible if folks don't start to actually try to turn these things around. And I'll leave you on a note of hope, Reed, which is that I am encouraged to see law firms and universities belatedly fighting back. A number of them capitulated early on out of fear, but I think folks are starting to realize you can't make a deal with the shark in the water. That shark is going to try to attack you, and they're picking up the harpoons and they're getting ready. And, we're going to try to do that for individuals too, so they don't face these same types of declines.
All right. So to that end, before I let you go, Miles, tell us where we can find out more about your legal defense fund and more about where you're writing.
I'm going to try to write really openly about this whole situation. My wife and I talked about it for weeks to think through whether we wanted to do that. And we very much would like to just fade into obscurity and grow our family. But this is insane and it's wrong. And so I'll be writing openly at treason.substack.com. Why treason? The president thinks treason is subversive and that criticism is subversive and treasonous. We think that criticism is patriotic. And so that's where you can find it. And then if, your good listeners are willing to be in this fight with us, folks can support the Legal Defense Fund, not just for my family, but for others who are targeted by presidential revenge at endpresidentialrevenge.org.
That's endpresidentialrevenge.org. Guys, go there, take a look. If you can, pitch in. Guys, as always, you can find me on social media at Reed Galen or at Reed_Galen USA. I also have a Substack at the Homefront. Miles, thank you so much for joining me.
You take care and let's stay in touch. And I'm grateful for you, brother.